Today on Head Mounted Destinations, we'll be talking about what we're calling VR funk, and how a new game on the block, Demeo, got us out of our latest funk. But first, what is this VR funk? I feel horrible saying funk like 4 times in 30 seconds.
Today's a very funky episode, because we couldn't think of a better word than funk.
Hello and welcome to Head Mounted Destinations, a podcast about VR and VR game development. We provide our perspective as devs and give a sneak peek to those interested in how VR games are made. I'm Carlos and I'm a game designer, and with me as always...
Hello, I'm Matt. I'm a gameplay programmer.
Before we dive into today's episode, we want to address a comment from one of our listeners. On our episode Pistol Whip as a Service, we got a comment from Denny Unger, the CEO of Cloudhead Games, makers of Pistol Whip, and he said, "Great podcast. Related note, we debated rhythm haptics as default for launch, but battery life became a topic of concern. There is no line in the sand rhythm mechanic in Pistol Whip, and it takes time for people to grok how it's different. That rhythm is actually a spectrum of opportunities." Very interesting comment from Denny Unger. I'm especially curious to know what this spectrum of opportunities may hold.
This is a really great comment. I'm glad that he left it. It has 2 components, right? The first is talking about the rhythm haptics, which we called out as, it adds a lot to the game. It should almost be default. So it's interesting that they actually tried that and it came up against a technical concern, which is a big part of game development. So that's super interesting. Not something I would have thought of, but it makes a lot of sense once he calls it out. The other half is this idea that it's not a traditional rhythm game, Pistol Whip, in the sense that it has like a strong central rhythm mechanic. He says that there's this idea of a spectrum, which I think is really saying people can sort of play it in different ways, and it takes on different aspects of a rhythm game. That's what he means when he says line in the sand rhythm mechanic, is there is no pass-fail. You can either embrace the rhythm strongly or weakly, and that's a spectrum.
Ah, interesting. Okay. So rather than Guitar Hero saying you must hold red, green, and blue and strum at once, Pistol Whip might present you with like those 3 options and then, let you freeform into that. And these options kind of translating from those colored buttons to, do I pistol whip a guy? Do I shoot a guy? Do I go for the headshot or the multiple body shots? Like that type of thing. And I think that's actually what makes some of these mixed reality videos that we see for Pistol Whip so entertaining. Some people actually like dance throughout the level and they just magically choreograph all the killing throughout. So yeah, this was a great comment from Denny Unger. And if you want your comment read on the podcast, please comment on an episode. We'll take a look, we'll respond, and you could potentially be featured on the next Head Mounted Destinations. All right, back to the show.
It describes it well, right? It's when you're in a funk in general, it's very like weirdly moody and like self-circular and just, I don't know. It's hard to describe, which is why the word funk is used.
Yeah, and when we're in a funk, it's generally, as another word, we could say we're in a rut, right? Like, you just feel like you're in this lull, almost like your car is stuck in the mud, and when you try to get momentum in either direction, you end up just slipping back down, like, into the pit.
It's a little bit like going to the gym, right? Where you've got a routine, but then one day you skip it for whatever reason, and then the next time you're like, I could, but like, I don't know, I'm just not feeling it today. And then suddenly you're like 2-3 weeks down the line and you're like, I really should go and play that game, but I'll just play this other thing instead, or I'll just watch TV. Like it's kind of been a long day. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly you're in a funk where it's like you're talking to people and they're like, oh, like, have you played any, VR games? And you're like, really? I haven't been playing any VR.
Yeah, and it comes as kind of like a mild shock to oneself, because at least when you play VR as much as us, you're thinking like, oh yeah, I played this, that, the third, and then you just kind of like get this sort of like, oh, I forgot my own name like moment, like, no, I haven't been playing this. And I think you touched on something interesting with your example. You said like, oh, I should play VR, and I don't know if I like identified this at some time earlier, but I think that's like a really good thought to isolate. To a fair extent, we want players to say, I want to play VR. And I think we still do say that in that funk scenario, like, but it does almost feel more like a should, right? Like, in a way, you have this like multi-$100 piece of equipment. You were very passionate about it. And then in your mind, seemingly you just like sort of like totally forgot about it. And now, and maybe to an extent, there's like some sort of thought of responsibility that like, I should get use out of this. Like, do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, totally. I keep going back to the gym analogy because it works for both that and the other thing where like maybe you have a gym membership and you're like, oh, I paid for this, I should really go to the gym. And then there's also the, like, I know VR is fun. I know I've had fun in the past in the same way that like, I know exercising makes me feel good, but there's something else in your brain that just like makes some sort of subconscious calculation and you end up going like, I'll just flop down on the couch instead.
Yeah. I guess that's a good time to bring up why we think this VR funk, why this happens to people.
It's worth noting this happens to not just us. Like, it's a phenomenon that I don't think has been named yet or like is like very clearly identified in the public consciousness.
Right.
You see this a lot with people commenting of like, oh, like I got VR and I played it for a while, but my headset's been sitting in the closet for 3 months or 6 months or whatever. And like, I just can't get back into it. And we maybe initially thought of that as like, I don't know,
low content library. Like, people would complain like there's not enough games, like, you know, not enough other things. But now there's a plethora of games, but people are still coming up with the same comments. Like, I literally answered a comment on Reddit this week of like, hey, I played these 3 games. Are there any other cool games out? I haven't played games in weeks. And it's like, my guy, open up your phone, go to the store page, check out head-mounted destinations. We can show you so many games that should keep you like very much tied into the VR ecosystem for so long. Yet we all experience this ebb and flow of like flaming passion for playing VR and then ice cold like dry spells of just like almost like rest and recovery.
Exactly. So we've solved the content issue, but these funks still happen to people. Why is that? We've identified 4 main contributing factors that we think build into these funks. The factors are tiredness, which is, I don't have enough energy to play a VR game. That's sort of the reason you give. It's like, I'm not up to it today. The second factor is inertia, which is like, there's going to be too many interruptions. Oh, I have to wait to update the game. Oh, I need to recalibrate my Guardian system. I need to move furniture, whatever. The third factor is discomfort, which is like, you know, I'm not down to get any like motion sickness, or I don't like how the headset hangs on my head or neck. It's uncomfortable. And the fourth factor is indecision, which is maybe you get the headset on even, but you're browsing all these titles and nothing stands out. I don't even know what to play. Or you're trying to choose. You're like, I could play Beat Saber. I could play Until You Fall. I'm not really... I'll just skip it tonight.
Yeah, to add on to that example, part of the indecision, you know, beyond just the Netflix like choice paralysis, is the fact that you're also considering that energy level, which we covered on in Tiredness, but there's like other silent factors that would have to do with like confrontation and how much like mental commitment it takes to even tell yourself, yes, I want to get into this game, which then leads to us sitting on the couch and playing Fall Guys and talking with our friends or something. So we just explained to you the 4 contributing factors, which were tiredness, inertia, discomfort, and indecision, or TIDI for short. So we're going to actually get into TIDI soon, but first we need to talk about Demeo. Demeo is a newly released game that is a turn-based tabletop RPG meant to recreate the experience of playing D&D in your friend's basement You have yourself and 3 other friends sitting around a table with a 3D map of the dungeon in front of you. You can move around the board by grabbing your character model. You grab and roll a dice to attack, and you play cards to use spells. It's really good, low energy fun. Right now, there is only 1 module, so that's like 3 floors leading to 1 boss. But this game is from Resolution Games, makers of Blast On, which gets updated quite often. So we expect to see more modules, more bosses, different spells, and all that other stuff coming to Demeo in the future. Right now, it is safe to say that Summer 2021 will bring an update to Demeo, which will bring a new boss, the Rat King.
If you're familiar with our opinions on games, off the cuff, this might not seem like something would be super into as far as a VR game, but it got us out of our funk. And this is interesting. We want to examine, how did it do this? Well, it actually overcomes a number of those pillars we talked about, the factors that contribute to the funk, TIDI. First off, the fact that you're just sitting around a board and you're very casually playing really overcomes a lot of the tiring and discomfort factors. And the fact that it's a new game on the block, well, that dodges indecision simply by nature of being the new shiny thing. So that's 3 of the 4 TIDI factors. The game still has a bit of friction. Its UX is not super amazing, but that's okay. It does enough to drag us out of our funk. So we wanted to use Demeo as a bit of a foil for examining this concept of VR funk and trying to extract any design lessons that we can, right? As developers, how can we build games that address these factors? We're not saying that every game should have to deal with the fact that players are often tired and uncomfortable and indecisive, but clearly a lot of people fall into these kinds of funks. And so as a developer, if you want to reduce player loss from your active player base, as well as maybe gain some of those players who don't want to play anything else, get them back out of their VR funk into our game, then there are certain things we could do consciously to design around these TIDI factors.
What we're hoping to see in the future, or in some utopian vision of like a VR marketplace, is that the players who fall into this VR funk get pulled in by games that have a good TIDI level, and then when players are now back in like shallow waters, right? They're back in VR. They're like, okay, the headset's not that uncomfortable. I don't have to use that much energy. Then it's a slippery slope to super hot, blast on, whatever the hell you were playing like just last week, right? So that's kind of like why we're advocating for this right now. And that's why we're saying like not every game needs to address this. There's like a circle of life here. There's an ecosystem that something can happen in.
Exactly. So getting into it, the first factor, tiredness. One of the big things about Demeo is the fact that you can play it sitting down, which is a big thing. Just the feeling of, I have to like stand up to play is a big factor against getting into VR. So a game that can easily be played sitting down, and really, to generalize this, has minimal motion. You're not flailing your arms or twisting your body, turning your head a bunch. It's just low energy input, and that reduces the barrier to entry.
And something I want to add as an anecdotal thing is that sitting can very quickly become a double-edged sword and cause damage on the neck, essentially. This happened while I was playing Raccoon Lagoon. I may have mentioned it in a different episode, but I was having so much fun with that game. I played it for like 4+ hours straight on like my first sitting, and it's a sitting down game. But I ended up like getting a hurt neck because of the way the game was set up. So I just want to say props to Demeo for giving players the ability to tilt the table, therefore reducing neck strain by making me look down at the D&D board.
And that also plays into discomfort a little bit, I think. But, that's the beauty of VR, is you can have these impossible experiences, tilting the board up so it's like on a wall, basically, but still moving these figurines around in 2D space. Like, that's not easily achievable outside of VR.
Absolutely. It's so cool. Everything sits in its place. You're able to roll the dice with correct physics. Like, The only thing is that you're just more comfortable now while playing, and that's fantastic.
We've been talking about minimizing motion thus far for counteracting the tiredness aspect of TIDI, but tiredness is actually largely in your head, not in your body. It's the psychological energy is the biggest factor rather than physical tiredness. And we see that where like even the thought of doing a tiring activity is itself a deterrent that makes you more tired, right? Thinking about putting in the energy to like play super hot is going to be like much more tiring, and you're just like, oh yeah, I'm exhausted. I can't move up to it, rather than Demeo, which is like sit still and like roll some dice. But there are other things that contribute to the psychological energy factor of tiredness. There's the low social cues if you're in a multiplayer experience of you can't read people's body language or maybe hear their voices clearly as you would in real life. And that's just a mental strain, mental load.
Exactly. Yeah, cognitive load is getting like overwhelmed. It's mostly about the mind having to spend a tiny bit more energy parsing information the world is giving to it. We need to like use our brain power to process like what's being said to us, where is someone gesturing, and actually more so because this game requires a fair amount of coordination, we need to like identify who is doing what gesture, right? When I say like, hey, in this top left corner of the dungeon, and then you got to like look around because your board's not rotated at the same orientation as my board, and you're trying to like find my gamer tag to like associate whose hands are where.
But not everyone is represented as hands, and yeah.
Right.
Okay. Another thing that drains the mental reserves is dealing with ongoing physical discomfort. We'll cover that a little bit later when we talk about discomfort. And the last big thing that adds to the psychological energy drain or the mental energy drain is a combination of periods of non-interactivity where there's too little going on, and then times when there's no emotional or mental breaks where it's too high energy. So that's the two-sided coin of like sapping people's energy. So first, the non-interactivity is if you are in, say, like a black loading screen or just some other point where there's nothing to do, or you can't even chat with your other friends, you're basically in an isolation chamber. And like, this is incredibly sapping.
Right. We've touched on that a little bit in the past with like players are going to recognize once they're kind of out of the game experience at any second, they're going to recognize like what the real world is and, you know, what their body's feeling. And that is, again, harken back to games like Superhot or Beat Saber, where it's like your game loop is this constant on state, it's going to be high energy, and then you get these like 30-second moments or whatever in between where you're in a menu, and it's almost like you're going from like a hyper intense workout, like you're doing the insanity workout, and then you just say stop and like lay down at the end of it. Your body is going to get shocked, and it's very jarring. You want a cool down period. That's why workouts have cool down periods and all that. So the last thing we need to bring up for the tiredness, and something we see across almost like all VR titles, is this sense of confrontation that's always present. You want to reduce confrontation in your game, like even down to silent, invisible confrontation, aka intimidation. Let's take Waltz of the Wizard, for example. Something that I went into thinking, oh, it's going to be kind of like whimsical, wizardy stuff. Sure. I ended up going in there and was immediately greeted with like an intimidating atmosphere. Everything's kind of dark. The doors are sharp. There's like skulls around me that can talk, but they talk creepy. And already my body is like starting to sweat a little, because I have like willingly put myself into this world. I don't fully know its rules and stuff. I do know that it can't physically hurt me, but I don't know what it will expose me to visually or what tricks and doodads it's going to do, right? So it makes my mind very uncomfortable when it's in a foreign place that like also may have like aggressive entities in it. So I guess that is to say, try to reduce the confrontation in your game. Like, look at everything through the lens of confrontation. Will my player be intimidated by this? Will my player be unsettled by this? Will my player be made mentally uncomfortable by this?
I think this is probably a whole episode that we could do talking about this. And there's a number of factors that cause this, everything from like a lot of the developers are like action-oriented males, down to like it's actually just easier to make a compelling game by introducing danger. Like it's a very basic type of hyper-real experience. So anyways, to summarize, how do you make your game less tiring? Allow the player to play it sitting. Allow the player to easily read social cues as much as possible. Never put the player in an isolation chamber where they can't act. Give the player areas where they can rest, they can chat with their friends, breaks from the intensity, and try making experiences that aren't always about intimidating monsters or being in peril. Make relaxing experiences.
Now, speaking of things that drain our energy, let's talk about inertia. Inertia is our next pillar we'll get into, and what we're talking about when we say inertia is, for example, when you have to find and make space to play your game, then when you put on your headset, all of a sudden you need to swap batteries. Well, now the batteries are swapped, but the Guardian is misconfigured. Now the Guardian's set up, but the game needs to update. Like, you just keep hitting these horrible, distinct interruptions to the flow of getting into the game. You'd think, let me just slap on the headset. You go out, you buy a Quest 2 expecting a just smooth jump into the game experience. Hell, I'd wager you go out and buy any HMD with the hope that you can just put it on, choose the game, and get into the game. But instead, we have these roadblocks that pop up, and that plays towards our inertia. So, how can we reduce this friction to getting into our games? One thing we can do as developers is reduce load times, or at least make our load times interesting.
Yeah, that was something I noticed when I booted up Path of the Warrior. Its load screen where, I don't know, it has to unpack assets or do some sort of technical setup in the background. Now, unlike Population 1, which just has a boring loading circle in a black space, Path of the Warrior had theme music and like a cool colorful logo and a spinning little burger icon. And it was just a little bit more visual candy or whatever, and like an interesting audio thing to listen to while I had to wait and load. It wasn't necessarily the shortest of load times, but it wasn't, I got so bored I popped off the headset. The music is like still getting me in the mood, and so it's less of an interruption to the flow of my user experience. Really short load times, though, is just a subset of the larger rule, which is you want to minimize the amount of time between the player putting on the headset or deciding that they want to play VR and them actually playing the game. And so this is something that is tackled, I think, both from the platform side and from the developer side. But from the developer side, the main thing you can do is make sure that the moment the player clicks on your icon on the library, you minimize the time to them actually performing the core game loop. So that maybe even comes down to skipping a start menu or saving calibration settings or doing silent calibration, anything to reduce the number of, we call it clicks in non-VR games, but in a VR game it isn't necessarily a button press or a mouse click. It could be, putting your arms by your side and then having a circle fill or something. But you want to reduce the number of interactions and the amount of time spent getting into the game. So we see some games that do this. Like a great example is the God of War game on PS4, where they don't even really have a start menu. Like it's a very seamless flow into the start of the game.
Right. You press a button and then you're just prompted to press the attack button to chop the tree that is literally on the title screen.
Exactly. And there's actually a platform constraint on PlayStation, because you have to have the player press a button in order to identify which controller they're using. But in VR, we don't have that constraint. We could literally, the moment we finish loading up, stuff into memory, throw them into an interactive space that is their menu, and potentially even load their latest save and have it in some sort of pause state where if they wanted, they could just immediately start playing. And if they want to switch to another save or do options, then they can open the menu. There's no need for us to have you got to calibrate. You got to hit accept on this terms of liability or whatever. Mm-hmm. You got to click load the save game. This is all interruptions to the user flow that, while they're common, they aren't necessary. And just thinking about, do we need this, or can we reduce the friction to the player getting into the game? Can we overcome their inertia? That's what's going to help get players who are tired and have high inertia into your game rather than some other game that takes more setup.
Yeah, and to tie this back into Demeo, I think their inertia factor is pretty good. It probably could use a little bit of streamlining, but basically to get into a game of Demeo, when you load the game, you get the like hello narration that can be skipped with the A button, thank goodness. You get to the main menu, right? Now you press a second button to say just like play solo. Now you're pressing a third button to click your character model to select. Then you are told move your character model across the game board onto the dungeon door in order to start. So that's like 5 or 6 clicks, also being paired with like moving a character across the board. That's not all too much, but I could certainly see like the button hold maybe being like reduced in time, or some factor being like a little more streamlined. I understand and find it kind of cool how they presented sort of getting all the players in a lobby and then, you know, moving them to the dungeon door to ready up. But that being said, it still does take maybe a moment or two too long to get into a game.
I would say inertia is where Demeo does worst in terms of addressing the TIDI factors. I think it's actually fairly high friction getting into the experience. But one of the things that I do like is the fact that you can drop into a game at any point. There's always the room code around the border of the table. Mm-hmm. And so if a friend wants to join your game, even if you're on the last level, they can just hop in.
Yeah.
And that is a huge bonus because, you know, you might not think of it, but waiting for your friends to finish the game they're in so you can join up is a huge interruption to the regular flow of the game. And so that's a good example of, it's not something you would normally consider as causing inertia. It's like, well, of course, you just have to wait for the end of the game. But like, why? Do you have to wait for the end of the game? Sure, you're dropping the player in and they're under-leveled. They don't necessarily have that much power and they're going to be outclassed by the enemies, but they're still playing, and that's preferable to not playing.
Yeah, exactly. And big props to Demeo for having that smooth drop in, drop out. Even when you're in the middle of a campaign, I think, you know, what had happened to us was like we were on floor 2 and your headset died, and then we like did stuff for an hour or so and your headset was charged up. I still had the game running, and you were able to seamlessly drop back in exactly where your character was, exactly in the state it was with all your cards. And I was just like, wow, this is good quality of life. And the fact that I see it here is like, I just want to like actually physically clap, but I don't want it to mess up my microphone right now. So
right, so we've talked about tiredness and inertia, the first two TIDI factors. The third TIDI factor is discomfort, and this is largely physical, and it's a ongoing strain, like a moment-to-moment impact on your experience, as opposed to the inertia, which is single events that interrupt your experience. Discomfort is really about the headset hanging on your neck and tiring your eyes from looking at the display, as well as the ergonomics of, you know, if you always have to look down, then that's going to cause neck strain. And if you always have to be raising your arms to interact with things right in front of you, that's less comfortable than having your arms closer to your side in a more neutral state. And so this is tied closely to tiredness, but tiredness is about I don't have enough energy to play. Discomfort is specifically like, holy crap, my neck hurts.
Yes, and Demeo, like we mentioned earlier in the episode, avoids the neck discomfort, or at least allows players to avoid the neck discomfort by tilting the table. It is totally optional to do so. So if players do want to just look down at the board to have the authentic tabletop experience, sure, but you are probably going to get neck pain because of it. And with the hand placement, I feel like Demeo, like my hands are always at a rested position, like because I'm either sitting down with like armrests, it's totally fine to sit like that in the game. So you don't really have to worry about your hand placement, and you're only ever really using your hands to just like to move your character and or roll a die. You're not like slapping anything away or like doing quick, precise commands.
Right. Well, they have interact at range, which lets you sort of interact with things on the board without necessarily moving your hand all the way there.
Yes.
But I think the larger aspect is the fact that it's turn-based means that, half the time to 3/4 of the time, you don't have to be interacting with stuff. And so you can keep your arms by your side or in whatever neutral state. That's a larger principle as well of allowing your player to take breaks, whether that's taking a break from the action inside the game, or even making it non-punishing for the player to take off the headset for 5 minutes and go get water and just rest their face a little bit, and then hop right back into the experience without having to overcome a bunch of hurdles again.
Yes, and again, to circle this back to Demeo and Pop 1, we already gave you the example of like headset died, Matt charged it up, he came back in, we resumed the game. That felt amazing. Population 1, if I'm in the middle of a match or something, like I take off my headset, go to get water, which is like 10 feet away from me, maybe at most. By the time I get back, I'm kicked out of the match, I'm kicked out of my party, and I have to go through the whole process over again of like waiting for my friends to finish a game, trying to communicate with them, then trying to party up with them if communication's successful, and yada, yada, yada. Like it's just really a big pain. So like, great job again, Demeo, for doing good by us there.
The final discomfort factor is motion sickness. We've talked about this in the past. I think everyone's fairly familiar with it. It's a big aspect of VR is people get motion sick. If you're looking to decrease TIDI and capture these players that are in a VR funk, make a game that doesn't make people motion sick, and they're more likely to have a favorable memory of it because they aren't made physically ill by it. And Demeo does great on this factor, where you're sort of just standing still around a static thing. I think actually Demeo could do better because they have table rotation and scaling that is kind of disorienting, and they could maybe have some sort of vignetting or other subtle effect to reduce the motion sickness when you're moving the table around, but it does an okay job.
Yep. Now, to bring it in, our final pillar, our final factor, indecision. How can we reduce indecision for those experiencing the VR funk?
Indecision, right? It's I put on the headset maybe, but like I don't really know what I want to play, and then I just don't play anything. It's that choice paralysis. And there's things we can do as individual developers to counteract this, but there is also a larger ecological solution, which we'll talk about in a second. But as a developer just working alone on a game, one of the things you can do is you can make your game more appealing than all the other games, so that when a player is thinking, oh, what do I want to play? They'll always go to your game. And you do this by creating a sense of home in your game, similar to how the Netflix homepage is a home, where you can go there and then, maybe I'll jump into this show, maybe I'll jump into that show, but it's a staging ground where you go and then you hop off into other things. And so creating that within your game where you go and just hang out and it's psychologically safe and it's fun. And then from within that starting point in your game, you can jump off into like doing a run or resuming a saved game or doing a little like daily challenge. That's going to help players come into your game because the friction is lowered.
Yeah, and the last thing that we can do as developers is provide content updates to our game. It provides better value proposition for customers in the future, and it gets players to say, ooh, something shiny, and like come back to your game.
As we were talking about this, we realized that it's more than just individual developers trying to overcome the indecision factor. It's almost a responsibility of the whole platform ecology as a whole. It's an ecological problem, this player indecision. For example, when you put on the headset, the first thing that you're greeted by is the Oculus user interface. And this is a place where the platform or potentially a large publisher can really come in and solve the indecision problem by creating sponsored events or highlighting recently updated games. Oculus actually does this to a certain extent, highlighting recent updates, And they try to create events, but these events aren't necessarily effective at overcoming indecision.
Something additional that we can do from the publisher platform angle is creating meaningful events. So when I say meaningful, I'm mostly saying what we take for granted in the non-VR medium. So like double XP weekends, special modes happening for like a week or two. We don't see that in VR, really. I will give props to Pop 1 and some other games for doing some updates to kind of like go with the times. I think Pop 1, they like put snow on their map during the winter. Like that's neat, but we don't really have anything that's actually like meaningful, like intrinsic reward to the player, such as double XP, more unlocks, different skins, what have you. These type of events really drive people in. Like we need someone at a higher level to like help facilitate the ecosystem. I believe that nurturing the player base with these events and by helping guide them to certain games through better highlighting updated games and what those updates are, I think that just raises the tide for all the other ships in the VR market. So last thing I wanted to say on the ecological perspective that we've been talking about right now is the big publishers like Nintendo, Sony, Xbox, 2K, THQ, whatever like big entity has like several game releases within its wheelhouse, they all have a portfolio, like some type of big Marvel Cinematic Universe type schedule of all their titles. Like they don't just let devs like willy-nilly like make the game and be like, it's gonna come out and it'll come out at this time and that's totally fine. No, like they're looking at like where games are in development and when they'll come out compared to their other games, and they're trying to hit like certain genres at certain times and this, that, and the third. Oculus is looking down at the big roadmap. They are the ones that then have the visibility to say, oh, we can make a double XP weekend here to get people playing Echo Arena. Oh, we could put a Lone Echo skin here into Demeo to help get people to play Demeo and like reward them if they've played this other game. Like this really dope, well-executed ecosystem that players will want to return to.
The two big factors I'm seeing there is like the cross-promotion is a big aspect. Cross-promotion, yeah, it's the tide that raises all ships, right? You're getting players from your game into my game and players from my game into your game and just getting awareness, which discoverability is one of the big things that devs have to fight against is how do players even find out about your game? Having cross-promotion is a great solution to the discoverability issue. And then the second aspect you were talking about is timing. And I think that's also really important, where you don't let people fall into a funk because there's always like one or two new things. There's not a flood of new things and there's not no new things. Mm-hmm. There's always one or two new things. And that addresses the indecision issue where you're not presented with a bunch of choices. There's one thing or two things. And then you say, oh, I like this better than this. If there's an echo event and a fishing event, well, a player probably only likes one of those games or likes one of those games way more than the other. If we nailed those two factors ecologically rather than as individual developers, I think that would go a long way towards preventing VR players from falling into this funk via indecision.
Yes, and to take this idea to a like 2075 level, like just super cool future, if this coordination could happen with hypersports, our whole idea of like VR sports that push sports beyond reality, if these could follow a coordinated update and or like basically a season, like we get multi-hypersport league seasons, and the cross promotion you mentioned is happening, but also the decision of like what sport you want to see / play at what time is like still there. So oh, this is like real VR fishing season as well as Echo Arena season. And then like in 3 months, it's going to be Blast On season and Demeo season. And in like 2 more months, we're going to go back to Echo Arena, but now there's like Hyper Dash as the other choice. Like, I think that's really cool, and tying that into the battle passes and the seasons and, cross promoting through cosmetics, all of that would be absolutely like, it would be amazing. It would be so cool. I just picture that as like so future that I put on my headset and the Oculus like banner opens up and I'm seeing like a big banner for like Echo Arena Season 2 Double XP Weekend from like February 2nd to February 8th, 8 p.m. And like real VR fishing or even Demeo is just like, special cosmetic if you play like but on this date range. Like it's not even a double XP. It's just, hey, log in, play around, you get a cosmetic. Like that's cool enough. That gets people back in. I would love to see more of that. And I think many others would too. So to bring this big thing back all together, everyone can get tired. Everyone has inertia. Everyone gets discomfort. Everyone is indecisive. Follow the law of TIDI, and our gamers may be more happy.
I'm very glad that we inspected the concept of VR funk. It definitely is a phenomenon, and breaking it down into these 4 factors is actually super helpful, at least for me, of thinking about what is it about a particular game that makes me not want to hop into it. I'm going to be thinking about this going forwards. I'm all about the TIDI now.
Me too, man. TIDI is a new lens to look at things through. If you like this episode and want to hear more, please visit headmountedpodcast.com and sign up for our email list to get notified about new episodes.
You can listen to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcasts.
If you'd like to discuss this episode or suggest future topics, visit our subreddit at reddit.com/r/headmountedpodcast.
And if you're loving the show and you want to help us out, you can tell your friends about Head-Mounted Destinations. Word of mouth really helps us out.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you at the next Head-Mounted Destination.